Resolved, advanced artificial intelligence development should be subject to internationally binding regulation to mitigate existential risks. Affirmative constructive. Definitions. Advanced artificial intelligence, AI, computer systems that exhibit autonomous decision-making, learning, and generalization capabilities beyond narrow task performance, often including large language models, general-purpose systems, or future artificial general intelligence technologies. Internationally binding regulation. Legally enforceable rules agreed upon by nation-states through treaties or conventions that obligate compliance, with mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement. Existential risks. Threats that could irreversibly undermine or extinguish human civilization, such as loss of human control over superintelligent AI or runaway autonomous systems. Existential risks include global catastrophic outcomes beyond localized harm. Brookings. Resolution interpretation. This resolution argues not merely for voluntary guidelines or regional laws, like the EU AI Act, but for internationally binding agreements, enforceable treaties or conventions, to govern the development of advanced AI in order to prevent the most extreme potential harms. Criterion for decision: most effective prevention of existential harm to humanity. The debate should be weighed on which side more effectively makes it less likely that advanced AI development leads to catastrophic or human civilization-ending outcomes. Contentions. Contention 1, existential risks from AI are real and require global coordination. AI capable of autonomous strategic action raises risks that could challenge humanity's control over its future. Research identifies potential pathways where advanced AI might cause irreversible harms if ungoverned, including loss of control, unaligned goals, or systemic failures affecting global infrastructure. These risks reach beyond national borders and therefore cannot be sufficiently mitigated by individual states acting alone. Brookings global leaders and international organizations have recognized the urgency of coordinated action. The United Nations Security Council debated AI's dual nature, that it offers vast opportunities but also significant threats, and urged legally binding restrictions on certain uses, like lethal autonomous weapons and AI-driven military decisions, remaining under human control. Digital Watch Observatory. This global acknowledgement underscores that major AI risks transcend jurisdictional boundaries and require international governance frameworks to create common rules, share data, and enforce compliance. Contention 2. Current fragmented regulation is insufficient. While some regions have enacted or proposed AI laws, for example, the EU AI Act and the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence, these frameworks are regional or voluntary in nature and do not create a globally unified set of obligations. Wikipedia. Without binding international agreements, states may engage in regulatory divergence, weakening safeguards. Competitive pressures could push nations to relax rules to attract AI investment. Corporations might exploit loopholes by developing in weak regulation jurisdictions. Fragmented regulation also lacks standardized enforcement and monitoring mechanisms across nations, leaving gaps that could be exploited by malicious actors, state or non-state. Contention 3. International agreements can harmonize safety standards and build trust. Legally binding regulation would create common minimal standards for AI safety, accountability, transparency, and human oversight. A global treaty could mandate safety impact assessments, risk reporting and mitigation protocols, transparency and auditability of powerful AI systems, penalties for noncompliance. Such harmonization reduces competitive incentives to under-regulate and ensures that all major actors, governments and developers alike, face consistent responsibilities. Treaties like the Framework Convention on AI, already endorsed by numerous countries, show the feasibility of international cooperation. Wikipedia. By establishing enforceable norms, the world community can reduce the likelihood of AI causing systemic shocks, ensure shared accountability, preserve human values and rights in technological progress. Conclusion. Unregulated or loosely regulated advanced AI development presents risks that could be existential in nature, threats that go beyond borders and affect all of humanity. Only internationally binding regulation can provide enforceable, consistent safety guardrails. Close regulatory gaps exploited by actors seeking competitive advantage. Coordinate global mitigation efforts before irreversible harms occur. For preventing extreme outcomes, including loss of control over superintelligent systems, the affirmative better secures humanity's future. This concludes the 1AC.
The affirmative's criterion, most effective prevention of existential harm to humanity, sounds intuitive, but it's also so absolute that it can justify almost any restriction, even if it backfires. The negative asks the judge to weigh the round on risk management under real-world constraints. Which world produces the best net reduction in catastrophic risk given enforceability, geopolitical feasibility, and innovation incentives? That means credible governance that actually gets adopted and complied with matters more than idealized binding words on paper. On-case responses. 1. Binding regulation is not the same as effective regulation. The affirmative assumes a treaty automatically creates meaningful enforcement, but major analyses of cross-border AI regulation emphasize that treaty design faces practical problems. Verification, enforcement mechanisms, compliance burdens, and jurisdictional conflicts, especially when capabilities are largely held by private firms spread across many countries. Digital USD. If you can't reliably verify compute usage, model capability thresholds, or covert military R&D, binding becomes symbolic and may create false reassurance, not safety. 2. International binding agreement is unlikely in the time frame that matters. Frontier AI is evolving quickly. Treaty processes are slow and politically fragile. Multilateral AI governance efforts today have leaned heavily on non-binding instruments precisely because they are faster to adopt and easier to update as technology changes. K4D, the affirmative's approach, risks a fatal mismatch. By the time a binding treaty is negotiated and ratified, the underlying technical landscape has shifted. 3. Existing patchwork regulation is already pushing global standards without a treaty. The EU AI Act's extraterritorial reach pressures non-EU developers who want access to the EU market to comply, creating de facto global effects without needing a universal treaty. Morgan Lewis. So the AF claim fragmentation equals insufficient is overstated. Major markets can and do export standards through trade and market access, and those tools are enforceable now. 4. The AF's evidence base proves coordination can happen without binding regulation. The Bletchley Declaration demonstrates that leading states can agree on shared risk framing and cooperation while staying flexible and iterative. It's explicitly a political declaration, not a treaty, but it catalyzed ongoing summits and commitments. Gov UK. Even Reuters reporting on the Seoul summit highlights major AI firms committing to safety frameworks and restraint. Again, not a binding global treaty, but a real mechanism for near-term norm setting. Reuters. If the AF's own story is we need movement now, the negative world provides it sooner. Off-case arguments. Disadvantage 1, innovation FD trade-off. Regulation can reduce safety. Overly rigid international compliance regimes can slow safety-improving iteration, especially for smaller labs and open research ecosystems that contribute to red teaming, interpretability, and defenses. The US Congressional Research Service notes stakeholder concerns that additional regulation can stifle innovation, including among smaller companies, startups with fewer compliance resources. Congress.gov. If safety advances slow while well-resourced actors, including states, continue anyway, you get less transparency and weaker alignment progress, increasing, not decreasing, catastrophic risk. Disadvantage 2, geopolitical deadlock and lowest common denominator rules. To get internationally binding agreement among rival powers, rules tend to become watered down. Worse, great power competition can prevent agreement altogether or cause key actors to refuse participation. Reuters notes China's partial non-participation dynamics around summit formats, exactly the kind of political friction that breaks universal treaties. Reuters, the result is either A, no treaty, or B, a vague treaty that can't meaningfully constrain the highest risk military intelligence applications. Counterplan, net benefit option. Instead of a binding treaty, pursue a coalition-based, non-binding international framework. OECD-style principles plus Safety Institute coordination, market access enforcement via major jurisdictions. OECD principles show wide adoption and flexibility. They're designed to guide trustworthy AI while remaining adaptable. OECD. This achieves real coordination faster, updates more easily, and pairs with enforceable domestic regional tools like the EU AI Act's fines and extraterritorial leverage. Morgan Lewis. Why the negative wins. The affirmative offers an aspirational mechanism, binding regulation, but doesn't solve enforcement, timeline, or geopolitics. The negative offers a more feasible governance model that produces earlier, more adaptable, and more enforceable risk reduction, therefore better mitigating catastrophic outcomes in the real world. This concludes the 1NC.
The negative's core move is to reframe the round from prevent existential risk to only what's feasible quickly. But that's not a reason to reject the resolution. It's a reason to design binding regulation to be adaptive and enforceable. The resolution does not require a perfect treaty tomorrow. It argues we should subject advanced AI development to binding international regulation as the best end-state governance for existential risks. 1. Binding U effective is an argument for better treaty design, not for no treaty. Neg says verification is hard and binding becomes symbolic. But existential risk is precisely the category where symbolism is insufficient, so we need legal obligations plus monitoring institutions that can evolve. Even the negative concedes coordination is needed. They just prefer softer tools. The AF's position is that soft tools are not adequate when the downside is irreversible catastrophe. A treaty can incorporate technical verification as it improves, mandate reporting for frontier training runs, and create inspection audit regimes. The burden is comparative. Binding rules create stronger compliance incentives than voluntary norms. 2. Speed isn't a trump if the negative's alternative lacks teeth where it matters most. The negative leans on non-binding frameworks are faster. True, but speed only matters if it meaningfully reduces existential risk. The Bletchley Declaration and similar commitments are useful starts, but declarations are not enforceable. If a state or major lab defects under competitive pressure, non-binding norms have no credible penalty. That's exactly why the AF pointed out race dynamics and regulatory arbitrage. The worst-case actor can simply opt out. 3. Patchwork regulation export standards concedes AF harm while undercutting NEG solvency. NEG claims the EU AI Act export standards through market access. That is a regional enforcement mechanism, not a global solution. It also proves the AF's central point. Actors respond to enforceable rules. The question becomes, why stop at fragmented regional leverage when existential risk is universal? Binding international regulation harmonizes baseline standards, reduces loopholes, and avoids a world where safety depends on whether a company needs EU market access. Answering the disadvantages. In A, the CRS evidence is about stakeholders worrying regulation could slow innovation, but existential risk governance explicitly prioritizes safety over speed at the frontier. If the risk includes loss of control, then a marginal slowdown in deployment is a benefit, not a cost. Plus, binding regulation can be targeted at advanced AI, high-capability systems, while exempting low-risk research to preserve beneficial innovation. Geopolitics' lowest common denominator. This argument is speculative and self-defeating. It says, because agreement is hard, don't try. But international treaties exist in high-stakes domains precisely to prevent catastrophic harms: nuclear, chemical, biological norms. Even partial adoption by major AI powers would dramatically reduce risk by shaping industry standards and creating enforcement coalitions. And if some actors remain outside, binding regimes still create stronger coordinated deterrence than voluntary norms. Weighing on the AF framework, the judge prioritizes preventing irreversible catastrophe. The NEG gives a world of soft coordination that collapses the moment incentives shift. Binding regulation is the only mechanism with a credible pathway to durable compliance across borders and competitive cycles. Under risk management, you choose the governance that can actually hold when stakes rise. This concludes the 1AR.
Negative rebuttal, no new sources. The 1AR tries to turn every negative objection into better treaty design. That's a dodge, because the resolution is not, we should aspire to someday maybe have a good treaty. It's AI development should be subject to internationally binding regulation. The affirmative must prove that this mechanism is the best way to mitigate existential risks in the real world, not in an idealized future where enforcement magically appears. 1. The AF never solves enforceability, so their solvency is speculative. The negative's most important takeout remains: binding is not the same as effective. The 1AR says treaties can add monitoring and audits, but they never explain how you verify frontier AI development across borders, especially in security-sensitive contexts. If verification is weak, then a treaty is either toothless, no solvency, or intrusive beyond what major powers accept, no feasibility. Under either scenario, the AF cannot access their impact. The neg world is better precisely because it relies on mechanisms that already work: market access, domestic enforcement, and coalitions where compliance is achievable. The 1AR concedes the EU effect exists, meaning we already have enforceable levers without a global treaty. 2. Time frame matters. Existential risks are nearer term than treaty timelines. The 1AR says the resolution doesn't require a perfect treaty tomorrow, but that's exactly the problem. Existential risk mitigation is time sensitive. If frontier capability accelerates faster than diplomacy, then binding international regulation arrives late. That's not a minor issue. It flips the entire case. A slow treaty that might emerge after capability is already deployed does not mitigate the risk that matters most. By contrast, non-binding frameworks, summits, and coalition commitments can update quickly, and major jurisdictions can enforce standards now. The best risk reduction is what is implemented soonest while still being meaningful. 3. The AF turns soft norms into a straw man. The negative did not claim norms alone solve everything. We argued for a combined model: non-binding international coordination plus enforceable domestic regional regimes, plus safety institutes, plus market leverage. The AF keeps asserting no penalties, but penalties exist through fines, access restrictions, procurement policy, export controls, and licensing at the national regional level. Those are real enforcement tools. A global treaty adds little if the same great power dynamics prevent universal compliance. AF answers to disadvantages are impact turns that don't hold home. Innovation. DA, the 1AR says slowing frontier AI is good. That's too simplistic. If compliance burdens concentrate development in the hands of the biggest firms and states, the only ones able to comply, you reduce transparency and reduce the diversity of safety research. The next point is not innovation good abstractly. It's safety, innovation, and accountability mechanisms can be harmed by rigid global rules, especially if those rules are negotiated to be broad and vague, chilling legitimate research while failing to stop covert development. DA, the 1AR says treaties exist in other domains, but those analogies cut against them. Even where treaties exist, enforcement is uneven and compliance depends on verification and power politics. In AI, where the resource inputs, compute, data, talent are more diffuse than nuclear material, verification is harder and incentives to cheat are stronger. This makes binding even less credible, not more. 5. Weighing. The neg wins on net risk reduction. Even if you buy the AF's impact magnitude, the judge still weighs probability and time frame. The neg pathway has higher probability and faster adoption because it uses existing structures and incentives. The AF pathway has uncertain probability, agreement plus enforcement, and slow timeline. Probability and time frame dominate magnitude when the mechanism is the question. Voters equals 200 words. Voter 1, feasibility, probability. The AF offers an idealized treaty regime, but never demonstrates credible enforceability or adoption among major powers. The neg provides a governance model that is already happening through coalitions, principles, and enforceable domestic regional laws. Higher probability means better real-world risk reduction. Voter 2, time frame. Existential risk mitigation urgent. Treaties are slow. The neg approach acts now and can iterate as the technology changes. Acting late is functionally not acting at all. Voter 3, net benefit risk management. Even on the AF's own impact framing, you choose the world that reduces catastrophic risk most reliably. Binding international regulation risks deadlock, lowest common denominator rules, and compliance theatre. The neg avoids those traps and produces earlier, adaptable constraints.
At the end of this round, the judge's task is to decide which side offers the stronger pathway to preventing existential harm from advanced AI. On that question, the affirmative prevails because we defend the only governance model capable of durable, long-term compliance in a high-stakes, competitive environment. First, on framework, the negative reframes the round around feasibility and speed, but feasibility only matters insofar as it produces meaningful protection. Soft coordination without binding obligations fails precisely when incentives to defect are strongest. Existential risk is unique. One catastrophic failure outweighs many incremental benefits. That means the judge should prioritize durability and enforceability over short-term convenience. Our criterion, preventing existential harm, rightly centers irreversible outcomes, not temporary coordination. Second, on solvency, the negative never disproves that binding regulation creates stronger incentives to comply. Their core claim is enforcement is hard, but hard does not mean impossible, and difficulty is not a reason to abandon the only mechanism with legal teeth. Treaties can evolve, incorporate monitoring institutions, and scale verification as technical capacity improves. In contrast, the negative world collapses the moment a powerful actor decides voluntary norms no longer serve its interests. That is exactly the failure mode that causes existential catastrophe. Third, on time frame, the negative assumes treaties must be slow and static. That is an empirical claim they never prove. Meanwhile, existential risk is not a one-time moment. It is an ongoing condition created by advanced AI development. Even if coordination begins with partial adoption, binding international regulation locks in safety norms and reduces future arms race dynamics. Acting now and building durable structures is superior to acting fast with tools that cannot hold. Finally, on risk trade-offs, the negative's innovation disadvantage misunderstands the impact calculus. Slowing unsafe frontier deployment is a benefit when the alternative is loss of human control. Safety, not speed, should dominate when extinction-level harms are on the table. For these reasons, the affirmative wins on durability, compliance, and existential risk prevention. This concludes the 1AS.
Adjudication and decision. After evaluating the round under IPDA norms, I vote negative. Rationale. The deciding issue in this debate is mechanism solvency under real-world constraints, not impact magnitude alone. Both sides agree that advanced AI poses potentially existential risks. The disagreement is over which governance model most reliably reduces those risks. The negative wins because they consistently demonstrated that the affirmative's mechanism, internationally binding regulation, has low probability and slow time frame, while the negative's alternative produces earlier and more credible risk reduction. On framework, although the affirmative's criterion of preventing existential harm is compelling, the negative successfully reframed the weighing to include probability and time frame, which is standard and persuasive in IPDA when the mechanism itself is contested. The affirmative never fully answered the claim that a solution arriving too late fails regardless of impact size. On solvency, the negative's enforceability arguments were decisive. The affirmative repeatedly asserted that treaties can evolve verification and enforcement, but this remains speculative. In contrast, the negative grounded their case in existing governance tools, market access, domestic enforcement, regional regulation, and coalition coordination that already function. Judges typically prefer mechanisms that demonstrably work over aspirational structures. The time frame clash was especially damaging for the affirmative. The negative clearly explained that AI capability growth outpaces treaty negotiation and ratification, turning delay into a terminal solvency deficit. The affirmative's response, that existential risk is ongoing, did not resolve the concern that early failure is catastrophic. Finally, on off-case disadvantages, the negatives, innovation, and geopolitics arguments were never fully neutralized. The affirmative impact turn, slowing is good, was underdeveloped and did not address concentration of power or safety research trade-offs. The geopolitical deadlock argument stood largely intact. Task shaft decision, because the negative demonstrated higher probability, faster, and more enforceable risk mitigation. They win on net benefit risk management, even under the affirmative's impact framing. Winner, negative.